Thank you, Jessica. And I thank you for your work getting this interest group started and organized. I appreciate this opportunity to start talking to other people who are interested in similar research, and I appreciate your making it happen. So I'm Carolyn. I am an associate professor at Bowling Green State University. That's about 10 miles south of the city of Toledo, Ohio, and I'm going to be talking today about an ongoing evaluation that we've been working on for some time now with Toledo Lucas County, so that's the county juvenile justice administration. Before I'm going to switch over and show some slides, but before I do, I'd like to say thank you to my students Mercedes Pratt and Michaela King, who are both on this call today. Both have been working on this project. Particularly Mercedes has been at it for over a year now, and both have been instrumental in preparing this presentation. So thanks, guys. And as we take questions, don't be surprised if I kind of look at you and see if you have input as well. All right, so let's see if I can. There we are. Here we go. So share screen. Share screen. And now I think you're seeing what I'm seeing. Yes? Do you see the notes too, or just the slide? Because I clicked on the wrong thing. All right, well, we'll just do what we can do.
We see just the slide. We don't see your notes yet. If you make it full screen, then we'll just see the slide.
Okay, well, I'm not quite sure how to make that happen. So you can see the slide, you can see me, it's all good. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. So again, thank you to Mercedes and Michaela and also to Cynthia, who is not on the call today. What we're talking about is a grant-funded project. So I'm going to start with some history of the overall project. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of what we had planned for the evaluation, and then I'm going to get into how that has changed. Part of what my goals in being one of the first presenters is because we are in the middle of this, I would appreciate any feedback that people have. I have some questions as we're trying to figure out where we're going next. So this was funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. This is part of the Second Chance Act. It's a reentry demonstration grant, and they have adult and they have juvenile, so this is a juvenile grant. This was intended to be an 18-month grant with a 6-month planning phase, followed by a 12-month implementation phase. As I think I'll get into a future slide, a real focus of this grant is in reducing recidivism among high-risk juveniles, particularly with a focus on family-focused services. So already in this first slide, the grant should be over by now, but for a number of reasons that we'll talk about, it's been extended twice. And so now the end date, which I believe is a hard end date, is going to be September 2018. The funding agency is the Lucas County, so again, that's the Toledo metropolitan area, has a criminal justice coordinating council. So they apply for and bring in and manage grants for all kinds of justice-related initiatives in this area. So they received the grant from OJJDP. They subcontracted the other grant partners. BGSU, so Bowling Green State University, we're subcontracted as independent evaluators. So I'm in the psychology department. My co-PI, Adam Watkins, is in the criminal justice department. And then over the course of the grant, we've had 3 primary graduate research assistants. So Sarah Hassan, Mercedes Pratt, and Cynthia Colburn is our current RA. So the goals of the project, of the funded grant, was to provide family-focused services for 50 high-risk teens re-entering the community from detention. So high risk is actually operationalized as being in the moderate to high risk level on a structured risk assessment. So Ohio uses the Ohio Youth Assessment System, or the OYAS. That's administered by court officials at differing points in their contact with the system. And that yields various domains, but it also yields an overall risk score of low, moderate, or high. And so this grant was proposed to focus on those high-risk teens. and to reduce recidivism among the ones who are leaving detention. The idea is this is a demonstration grant. So originally a few sites were selected, and the idea is to prove, you know, what kinds of services work, and so to solicit ongoing funding once the original grant period is over. Stated in the grant, required as part of the application that we commit to reducing 5-year recidivism by 50%. So within the scope of the grant, we're expected to reduce recidivism, and that recidivism is supposed to be 50% less over 5 years. To kind of get a feel for the stats, so the target population already had a 30% recidivism rate within the first year. When you look at national studies of this high-risk teens, they have around an 80% recidivism rate over 2 years. So we're looking at high recidivism is the starting point. And so we pitched in the grant that we would lower that by 50% over 5 years. So how is the proposal going to do that? So the key stakeholders involved in this proposal are teens who are detained and their families, the court administration. So again, the coordinating council received the grant, but the rest of us are in a way subcontracted. The court administration includes, in Toledo, there is a youth treatment center. That is a detention facility. Youth are detained for 6 months. It is for high risk and or repeat offenders, but teens are expected that they could be rehabilitated. So this is not state prison. That's a different system for youth who are really sent to prison, where the goal at the other locations is to warehouse them and not to rehabilitate, but the goal for the youth treatment center is to rehabilitate. And they have a structured 6-month program. It's cognitive behaviorally based. There's also the Juvenile Detention Center. They weren't originally going to be involved in the grant. The focus was going to be on the Youth Treatment Center. They came in later, but the Juvenile Detention Center is a typical jail for juveniles. It's short-term detention, typically pre-trial, and the median length of stay is about 7 to 10 days. Also within the court, there are 2 primary juvenile justice judges who are involved, and then various administrators at different levels. Part of the structure of the grant is that services would not just be provided by the court, but that there would be different community agencies that partnered. And so the primary community agencies are the local community mental health center, and they provide family therapy, so functional family therapy, and they're also originally contracted to provide alcohol and drug treatment. There's legal aid. So legal aid provides legal services for civil cases. So that's an important distinction, is that they are not providing representation. They're not providing defense attorneys. They're providing assistance with housing disputes or other kinds of problems. Usually it's the parent that's having the problem that brings them to the attention of legal aid. So the grant funds legal aid to work with the families for these high-risk kids. And there's also a family services center. It's faith-based, but you know, it's not run by necessarily a pastor, but they were originally involved to provide parenting groups. So in the original grant application, they have some experience working in the community, having parents come in and do what's called the Nurturing Parents Program, which is a structured parenting program. There are other, I just forgot to turn off my phone, other related services. So that's what they originally contracted to provide. And then finally, part of what the community put together is a youth reentry task force. So once every 2 months, members of different agencies that are concerned with youth reentering the community from detention get together to share ideas. There's often a presentation from one service provider or another. There's representatives there from the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board, from the police, from the different detention facilities, court administrators, education, a representative from the Toledo Public Schools. And so that Youth Reentry Task Force isn't necessarily directly involved in the grant activities, but they are kind of part of what's going on. So they meet monthly. Last bit of kind of historical background. So this is the originally proposed evaluation design. I think Some of what I'm talking about today is kind of common across program evaluation, while some of it is more criminal justice focused. So again, the treatment group was expected to be 50. So we proposed an N of 50 high-risk youth who are leaving detention. We proposed a pre-post design where we'd have a measure shortly before they left detention and then later on after they'd received services to assess parent and youth reported family functioning. So part of what we did is we used some of Staten and Kerr's parental monitoring and then parental warmth and bonding measures, but also more practical things like how often do you see your parents? Are you living with the parent who is the one who's involved? How many nights a week do you sleep at home? And so the original intent, because the goal of this reentry program is to reduce recidivism through the mechanism of improving family functioning, we wanted to assess family functioning. So grad students are going and they're interviewing teens and they're interviewing the one parent, matched parent or guardian of the teen. And that parent or guardian is typically identified by the court as the parent or guardian that the court is working with and coordinating with. Other data sources, the CMH is collecting structured mental health measures, so a symptom count that's filled out by both the parent and the youth about the youth's symptoms, and that's supposed to be filled out at the beginning of services, so right before they begin treatment, and then again at the end. Originally, there was a series of measures that was proposed associated with the Nurturing Parents program. As I'll talk about, that program didn't really end up happening, and so we don't have those measures. We have access to court records, so arrest history, service assignment, probation contacts, and there's this Ohio Youth Assessment System risk measure. And so for these youth, everybody gets that at least once. Most of them have it more than once because they're given it at disposition and they're given it again later as they're preparing to leave the youth treatment center. We also proposed to use a comparison group because we can't do random assignment. No one was interested in that in the first place. And so we proposed to use a historical comparison group where we are looking at the records of kids who were in the system before this grant was available. And there's two comparison groups, so it's a little tricky. In 2012, Lucas County opened a reentry treatment center. So in 2012, they already put forward a push to provide better services for kids leaving detention. But before that, it was more kind of just probation. And so we have two historical comparison groups, one for this period of time after the reentry treatment center was available, but before this grant, and then even going further back to see compared to the group that didn't have either available. We're matching youth using the OYAS. So because this has been administered for some time in Lucas County, we have historical records going back on the risk domains for youth. And this is important because Lucas County is very reform-oriented. They're part of the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So for a while, they've been really making a concerted effort to reduce the number of kids that they detain. So if we look back before 2012, youth who were detained back then tended to be lower risk kids than there are today. So today, they do everything they can to divert kids away from detention. The kids who are sent detention tend to be pretty high risk. So if we just compare detained kids now with detained kids 5 years ago, it's kind of apples and oranges, and it's not in the favor of the current treatment program. So we originally proposed a traditional evaluation design. So we were hired to be independent evaluators. It was not designed to be an empowerment evaluation. We were not planning on kind of working with them to help them improve their own ongoing evaluation capabilities. I suppose part of what this county does is they have other researchers that they work with. They have other funding sources for other programs. And so they're used to having universities come in as outside people and kind of provide occasional reports. So that's a model that they're used to, and that's what we originally proposed. So I'd like to talk a bit about what has changed. Everything I've talked about so far has been what we were originally planning to do. But I want to pause for a second and see, does anyone have any questions now for clarification or, questions about what we were planning on doing, what the original grant was designed for?
So we did have one question from Nicole, and I think you spoke to this a little bit as you described the Ohio Youth Assessment System a little bit more, but the original question was, is the risk assessment dynamic or static?
It's pretty static. So in theory, it could be done repeatedly, but then when that happens, it's not really by design. So it's given, and so the PI behind it, his name is Latessa, Latessa. And it was designed to have slightly different versions depending on which stage in the process you are, but that it yields dimensions that are useful across those different stages. I think primarily it's used, I think it's used in part for decision making about service assignment, just like we are. But I think in theory it could be used to inform other, other kinds of decisions. But it's not really intended to, it's not given repeatedly once it's been given at the specific stage. Does that answer, you're nodding, does that answer your question? All right, okay. Any other questions that people might have before I go charging?
I'm not sure if we have folks just on the phone, but is anyone on the phone that has a question? Okay, I have one question for you, Carolyn. So could you just kind of, in a nutshell, describe or define the evaluant? Like, what exactly is it that you're evaluating?
That's an excellent question. So what we are, that is an excellent question, and it should be an easy answer, and it's not. So we are supposed to evaluate the entire grant as kind of a system designed to reduce recidivism. So the outcome is recidivism, which is pretty limiting. But the intervention is really supposed to be more of a menu of services as opposed to a specific service. So originally it was supposed to be the ability of this collaboration. That's part of why the task force had to be part of it. The ability of people to come together and offer this variety of options. Which, given that we have an N of 50, is tricky, I think. So let me talk about, let me talk a little bit about where we've been going since our original plan. And I'll loop back around to your question because it was a little tricky in the first place and it's a little trickier now. So, as I mentioned, there's been changes in the original grant services and the timeline. So the original grant, so part of what happened is this court is very, like I said, they're very reform oriented, they're very active in procuring external funding to support initiatives, and it just so happened that when this grant was submitted, they were submitting another grant at the same time. And so they the court administrator stepped back and said, we wish we could really review this closely, but we can't, we trust you. And so the grant was submitted without them really going through the fine-tooth comb. And so what happened when the grant was awarded, they did go through it and said, well, these services that are proposed are not what we really need. What we really need is family functional therapy. And so they wanted to redirect some of the funds that were going to go to different services to go to that. But also in the mix is that there were two individuals who wrote the grant. They were with the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. They wrote themselves in as project directors, and one of them retired and the other one moved to another position between the submission and award. And so once it was awarded, several months went by before they were able to hire a project director, and kind of given the nature of the grant, with lots of different agencies doing lots of different things, in the absence of a leader, just nothing happened. And so that slowed everything down. After the court came in and said, we want to do family functional therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment. It's been supported for use in juvenile populations. And so that, though, required finding a vendor, so going through the bidding process and determining which CMH it was who's going to do it. Then that CMH needed to hire therapists to do the therapy, and they needed to go through structured training because it's an EVT. So that kind of the start date was pushed back almost a year from what it was originally planned, just because of that change. The faith-based family services were rendered more or less, in some ways it was rendered kind of redundant. So the FFT did a lot of the family training that the faith-based group was planning on doing. And so they needed to figure out, well, if we're not doing this, then what else are we going to do? They're still part of the grant and they're still receiving funds. And so they ended up doing something called family navigators. I'm not sure, it's relatively new. It's not a new idea. The idea is that families that have been through the system themselves serve as navigators to work with families who are going through the system now. And so, but that's kind of the program based out of the Bronx. And so that's been done primarily there. It's a grassroots organization. And now Toledo and I think Seattle is also replicating this. So that was a big change in what they were going to do. So that's been going for probably about, I want to say a year now, maybe. And then there was this addition recently. They decided to add another service. There's a group here that does film camps with at-risk youth. And so they decided to add that on, kind of in part because as the money got moved around, they had funds they needed to spend. Another change in the actual services is that the detention, kind of the reduction in detention initiatives were successful, which means that it's good news from a detention reform standpoint, is that they had fewer kids being detained. What that meant for the grant, though, is we were not going to get 50 kids being released from the youth treatment center in the course of a year. So this is a good problem to have, but what we needed to do is then kind of expand the target population. It has to be kids who are being released from detention, but we broadened it to include youth who score high on the OYAS, but were only briefly detained at the detention center. So really what this looks like is it's youth who are on probation who might have been detained very briefly before they went to trial, but they weren't really, this is not, when we think about re-entry, we typically are thinking about people who've been out of the community for a while, and that's not this group. So we've got this mix now of youth coming out of the youth treatment center and youth who are coming out of the shorter term detention. I'm going to look at my notes because I'm charging a lot. What this has meant for other things that have changed. So for the evaluation things that have changed, the pre-post-test model has not been successful. Pre-testing has been all right. Youth who are detained at the youth treatment center are easy enough because they're there. But youth who are not currently detained are difficult to recruit. So grad RAs have done everything they can do to kind of bring in kids or meet them if they have court dates. And they've had some success. So out of 47 youth who've been referred for services, there's been 36 who've been pre-tested. And a smaller number of parents have been pre-tested because they're not detained. And so we try to catch them when they're coming in for therapy with their kids, but if we don't catch them then, it's hard to get a hold of them. So we applied for additional funds through the court. They're funding small gift cards for parents to complete the pre-test, but that I don't think that's been all that motivating is my impression. I'll see what if Mercedes or Michaela want to chime in, I'll open it up in a second. Post-testing, though, has been a more serious problem. Only one post-test, as of a couple days ago when I prepped this, this talk, only one has been completed. And part of that is how we're defining when we post-test them. So there have been very low rates of youth who are assigned to functional family therapy actually finishing it. So part of what's happened with the evolution of this grant is really what it's become is FFT with other services also sometimes added in. But the kind of the major service that's being provided is FFT. And youth tend to drop out very early. And then the other kind of point where youth are dropping out of that service is when they're discharged from probation. So technically these services are not mandated. So that's an important distinction to make for this audience, is that the court is not mandating that they do family functional therapy. And I think the court has said themselves that they think that families don't understand that distinction. So even though they're clearly telling them this is optional, some families are going along with it because they think it'll reduce, the time their child has to spend in detention or reduce the probation period. And so when they're discharged from probation, they think that they're done with everything. And so they drop out of FFT then. Just an evaluation barrier is that the CMH is not permitting us to go along with them. So FFT is a home-based therapy. Therapists go to the families and meet them where they are, and they have asked that we not go with them on those visits. So even if it's the last therapy session where they're handing out kind of their conclusion measures, they don't want us there because we may be perceived as part of the court as opposed to part of the therapy providers. So we are not, at this point, we're kind of acknowledging the reality is we're not getting the post-tests. So we can use the pre-tests as a kind of way to divvy up different risk groups and, you know, kids and families who are at different levels of risk coming in, but we're not going to be able to say, here's how family functioning or family dynamics changed over the course of treatment because we're just not getting the post-tests either because they're not completing the treatment or because they're not talking to us once they complete. So we have been doing some things as part of our role as evaluators. We started doing quarterly reports. What happened was early on, that didn't look like the grant was doing anything much, you know, and a number of meetings were canceled. And so part of why we started doing quarterly reports is just to provide a reminder every quarter, this is what's actually been happening, you know, kind of shine a light for all the grant partners so everyone can see these are the number of kids who've been referred, these are the number of agencies that have been involved. So we've been doing quarterly reports. We just pretty much finished up a process report, which was not part of our original plan, but we've been going to these grant partner meetings and they've been talking about this issue where people aren't completing family functional therapy, related issues where kids who might have been good candidates for it weren't being referred. And particularly the legal aid services almost were being very much underutilized. And so we did a key informant study where we interviewed 11 grant partners to find out their different perspectives on what was going on and put them together. And so we transcribed those and did, you know, kind of a rough content analysis. The main themes that emerged, in general, everyone's really positive. You know, they think well of this grant kind of structure. They think well of each other, which is important. So we heard service providers saying very positive things about other service providers, but kind of across the board, people were lamenting the lack of communication. And saying, we don't know what exactly other providers are doing. Or everyone keeps throwing around the term functional family therapy, like we all know what it is, but I don't. And which was a surprise to me because I'm in a psychology department, you know, it was described early on and then they're right, everyone does talk about it, like everyone around the table knows what it is. And they also talked about communication being an obstacle to referral. Particularly the Family Navigators program, which is it's not that new anymore. It's on the newer side, but I think when it came on board, it was some stakeholders may have perceived it as another thing and didn't really learn what it was or how it could be helpful for their kids, and so they're not referring families to it. And then another theme that emerged was kind of these issues of family engagement and retention. Families, when they leave the youth treatment center, there's kind of a push right within that first week when they're released. So right when they're released within that first week, they're required to meet with their probation officer, I think it's twice within a 10-day period. They have to make contacts with the youth mentoring program. They have to make contact with at least one other program. So that first week or two after release is very, very busy. And so key informants expressed this concern about overwhelming them with another thing. You know, on top of all these other things these families are doing, having them make an appointment for a therapist, and yeah, the therapist comes to them, but they still have to make the appointment, you know, having one more thing for them to juggle. And so, but the drawback is if you don't catch them right away, you may miss the opportunity to get them engaged. You know, nice thing about FFT is part of the therapeutic process is engaging families in those first couple sessions, getting them all on board, working on shared goals. And so getting them into that swing of things right early when they're first being released would be a good thing. So right now, where we are right now, the comparison data, we have it. So the court has given us a huge data dump on youth over the past I don't even want to think about how many years. So Adam Watkins, the co-PI, is really taking over the comparison data piece of it, and he's working on it and he's cleaning it. And so we will be prepping the kind of official final evaluation in summer of 2018. We have committed to following recidivism for 5 years. So from the, time that the youth first is identified as being part of our treatment group, we follow them for 5 years, which is going to include following them in the adult system, which honestly is going to be kind of a pain. I'd be interested in hearing if anyone else has done something like that, because as of right now in Lucas County, these are separate systems. And so it's going to involve manually looking them up. So let's see. So this is my kind of wrapping up. I feel like, community psychologists are used to this, but, for me, this has been a real area of growth, is taking on more of we're not as independent, I think, as I thought we were going to be. Because as this grant was kind of evolving, particularly early on when there wasn't a project director or when the new project director was kind of ramping up and figuring things out, I felt like if we kind of took a step back, we would just kind of watch people struggle, as opposed to if we got more involved. So sending out meeting reminders or sending out these progress reports, it would help, but I didn't feel like we were really pushing the services in one way or another. So right now we're planning on sending out that key informant process report, probably in the next couple of weeks, having a discussion about that. I'll come back to that in a moment, because I have thoughts about what we can do with that. We will be doing the original agreed upon evaluation. We're not going to be able to do pre-post, obviously, but certainly treatment comparison group, and tracking that 5-year recidivism. And then to provide a little more context, I have done other studies with this court before, so coming in and more like Carolyn studies, doing a survey with youth in detention, and we have a positive relationship as of now. They've talked to us about possibly doing other program evaluations in the future. And so as we move forward, that's kind of part of the context, that this is not just I'm not planning on being done when this project is done. I'd be interested in hearing what questions you have for me. I think a question that I have for people who are on the phone now is this key informant process report. And honestly, this is a question just as much for Mercedes and Michaela, because I expect Mercedes is going to be doing more of this presentation. I think some of the feedback we'll be giving them is going to include recommendations for specific agencies. So while they tend to think well about each other in general, one of the messages of this overall report is there are weaknesses in this picture. So all these collaborations come together, but not enough kids are getting the services. There's lack of communication. And I think that it would be easy to end up with some finger pointing, and I don't think that's productive. And so that was a question I wanted to throw out and see what other people's thoughts or recommendations might be for that. But then obviously any questions that people have for me, I'd like to tackle those too. So now I'm willing to kind of step back, and I don't know how to make the slide smaller again. There we go. And have some discussion.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I think we're definitely going to cycle back to some of the concerns that you raised. But before we get to that, I actually do want to give folks the opportunity, if they have any other questions for Carolyn and her team before we kind of dive more into the discussion. Okay, I don't see anything popping up in the chat box. Folks should feel free to use that, or should just speak at this point and identify themselves. It's helpful to identify who you are before you start speaking, in case we have folks on the phone who cannot see who is talking. So I think kind of jumping in, we've got 20 minutes left together. So to what Carolyn just raised around this issue of having these key informant process reports where you're hearing from different folks, and when you're working in these systems with multiple agencies involved, that there is at some point going to be, well, this person didn't do what they were supposed to do, or this agency didn't do what they were supposed to do. I have some perspectives and insight on that I'm happy to offer up, but before that, I wanted to see if other folks What do you think about this? Is this something that you've worked with before in partnering with different agencies and organizations, and how have you handled this?
Well, and some of the management has to do with personalities too, right? So it's not just about agencies themselves; it's about the personalities within those agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might be able to frame. This is Nicole Friend too, speaking for those who can't see. You may be able to frame some of the gaps in communication as just that. They're gaps. They're not intentional, miscommunications. It's just that particular pathway to communication hasn't been opened yet.
Mm-hmm.
But there are going to be personalities who take that personally anyway. So it's definitely a challenge. One thing that I have done in the past that I think has helped is actually create a process map. So from the point where a juvenile begins this process, what is the first thing that happens? What's the next thing that happens after that? What's the next thing that happens after that? What does that timeline look like? And then who is involved in each of those points? And I think just the visual of seeing it helps illustrate where those gaps might be and how you might be able to create some of those pathways to engage the people who need to be engaged at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at some of these images.
I like that. I've seen them do this before, more as kind of explaining to me as an outsider how their justice system works, but we haven't done it with the grant, the pieces of the grant, where those realistically would come in. So I think that would be helpful because they have a framework. Like if I were to suggest this, they would, or Mercedes, if you were to suggest this, they would know what we were talking about, but it hasn't been done already for this. So thanks.
Yeah, and this is Jess Shaw, just really build off of what Nicole was saying. So I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Rebecca Campbell on a big project out in Detroit where we had this pile of 11,000 rape kits there, and then it was figuring out how did this happen, how do we respond to it, how do we ensure it doesn't happen again in the future. And while police were really in that critical role of picking up the kit from the medical facility and transporting it to the crime lab, most of those kits were not getting there, so there was kind of this easy, the police didn't do their job. But we really explained it to the group, and we had these type of key informant interviews where we were bringing this information back, and it was an action research project using developmental evaluation over several years. Really framed it from the beginning that we're taking a systemic lens to all of this work. So just as Nicole said, doing the visual kind of the process, we had a visual that kind of showed the role of police and prosecution and advocates and medical providers and survivors up on, we had a visual, right, where it showed all these different pieces and how they relate to one another. And so, yes, the police weren't submitting the kit, but that's because they were receiving messages from the crime lab that was telling them this, and they were receiving messages from the medical providers that was so really saying that this systemic approach means we're looking both within and then between agencies and how those interactions are what's causing the patterns that we're seeing. And so I think using that visual, like you said, Nicole, some sort of a visual to show like this is a bigger process, this is between agencies and systems, can help kind of place it within that context and help people not be quite as defensive.
Large to me, just based on
Thanks, and that's a nice example too of I think sometimes with the personalities, I don't know what you guys think, but sometimes there's a culture within some court agencies where they're more, like it is more hierarchical. People are kind of more used to more of a command structure, and if you don't do what your commander tells you to do, it's not good, and so I'm coming from a whole, different cultural orientation, and at least where, it sounds like you guys have worked within some of that as well. So, okay, that's helpful.
I think also that the model would be really good because, as Carolyn said, they are concerned about like giving too many services at one point in time, but that kind of makes it so that no one knows exactly whose job it is to refer. So if they decide personally, I'm not going to refer right now, if everyone makes that decision, then the kid never gets referred. Right. So no one really has that point where it's like, if I don't refer them, then they're not going to get the services. Like they don't recognize that.
Right. Right.
The other area that I thought, this is Jess speaking again, that perhaps there might be something useful in the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, over the past couple of years had an initiative related to Sentinel events review. And so Sentinel events is something that really comes out of the medical field and out of aviation. So it's when they do like they do the surgery on the wrong person, or they have a near plane crash. They have this kind of Sentinel event, which is something that goes terribly wrong, or really a near miss. And they get these committees, and people might be really familiar with this, where they get committees or in groups together to review what happened, and really looking at it through the lens that it's really slices of Swiss cheese layered on top of one another. It wasn't, Mercedes, as you were talking, it made me think of this. It wasn't that one person just didn't do the referral. If it was just one person, someone else in the system would have caught it and it would have been remedied. Not finger pointing and placing blame. Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, we lost your audio for a second, so I'm kind of
Oh,
like.
okay. Sorry about that. So in a nutshell, this Sentinel events might be something to kind of look at, and the framing around that. It's really hard to carry into a criminal justice context where the entire culture is around finding who's to blame, right? Like that's the entire culture of holding people responsible for things. So it's hard to translate, but it might be an area that you can draw upon some framing as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hadn't heard of that before. So I think, particularly if it's framed as coming out of NIJ, this is coming out of justice orientation anyway. Another question that I would just be interested in hearing about from this group is this just tension between being hired as an independent evaluator. The reason we're there is because we're not part of the court system, and that tension between, and that's kind of my ongoing relationship with them, is they've already said, well, we have other grants where we need an independent evaluator. But how independent are we really? One, if we have these ongoing evaluations, where we know it's the same faces around the table every time, but then also I'm not interested in sitting back and watching things not go well if we could do something. So I'd be interested in hearing what other people's thoughts or experiences have been like.
I think, this is Nicole, I think some of our experience has been, it depends on the partner. So this particular partner sounds to me like they're interested in partnering with you on some capacity building type of activities. So not just, a summative evaluation of did this work or did it not? Did we get 50% or did we not? It sounds like they're interested in the process and understanding, why you measure certain things at certain times and what that data means. And so in this context, I don't think you probably have to worry about it as much as you would if it were, for example, an NIH grant where a summative evaluation is all they're interested in. Mm-hmm. And you may or may not even really be involved much in the collection of the data, or, you may select an instrument and then get the data back and you're really only doing analysis. I think there's a big movement that I've seen recently in that capacity building, empowerment sort of evaluation type of activity, in that it's not just about your expertise and methodology. It's also about communicating that expertise to a domain that needs it. And if anything needs it, it's the justice system, that's for sure. So just from what you've described, just based on the relationship that you've described, it sounds like you're in a good position to be able to say, I think you could be doing some things a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. You're still not providing services directly as much, but what you're doing is you're taking the data in and you're critically thinking about it and analyzing it and then providing that back to them in a way that allows them to get better. And I don't know that they're interested necessarily in that purely summative, we don't want to have anything to do with, you other than you have a content expertise and methodology.
Right. I agree. And I think to your prior point, some of that is personality. They have a couple of very strong voices who really value research. And so they want to know where it's coming from. and I think, and that's also cultural. You know, there have been a series of administrators over the years who've shared that view. And so that kind of respect for research and valuing data-driven decisions. But it's interesting you make that point. You know, I think that there is room to kind of help them on that part of their journey as they are trying to make these kinds of decisions across the board, to see if we can maybe make this more ongoing.
Even if it's just recognizing when you need the research.
Right, yeah, right.
Yeah, and this is Jeff. I think you might be familiar with like, developmental evaluation from Michael Quinn Patton, which really has evaluators playing kind of these varied roles sometimes, but really as the evaluand might be shifting in response to the research you're sharing back with them. One of the things that I do when you describe this is hopefully there's going to be continued evaluation work with them. It's really this long-term engagement type of relationship rather than this one-off project. I have some partnerships here that operate in that same context. And so I'm really explicit with when I take off my researcher or evaluator hat, if you will. So when we're in these meetings, and folks will turn to me, which is great because they didn't used to do this, but now they'll say, oh, and Dr. Shaw, is there research on this, right? So that's really amazing that they're doing that. But there's a lot of research that we just don't know. And so when they ask me those questions, I will say, well, if I take off my researcher hat and put on my hat from the several years I was an advocate, anecdotally, here's what I can tell you. So I'm very explicit of when I'm saying from the research we know this, and when I'm saying we don't actually know this from research or from the evaluation, but here's just insight I can provide. And so I think it helps people still respect the research itself and still see it as objectively as they can. And they see me as kind of this neutral place in the room because I'm constantly being really explicit with what hat I'm wearing and what role I'm playing, depending on what the group needs.
Thank you.
And Carolyn, when you do good work, they're going to want more leadership from you, right? So if you're doing they're going to rely on you to help send out the meeting reminders, to help keep them on track because you're doing really great work.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions, from anyone or Mercedes or Michaela, feel free to chime in if you have to.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left together. So if folks have anything else they want to ask or comment on.
We'll see what happens next. I think one of the other notes I had to myself is kind of more along the same lines. Is this supposed to be a demonstration grant? The court is always looking for more funding for new things. And I feel like part of being a community psychologist is to try to support them in doing the work that they're doing. And like I said, I feel this tension between being supportive and providing this summative evaluation that might not be all that positive, so, but that's part of why we did the key informant evaluation, so we can contextualize that.
Well, I think 50% reduction in recidivism that's a big ask.
Well, and it's funny because everyone knew that, everyone around the table was like, oh, okay, we'll try to reduce recidivism, but where's this number coming from,
Yeah, that's a big ask, but it's, you can't know what you're capable of without big stretch goals, as long as there's the tolerance for understanding that reaching those big stretch goals is a little scary.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even sure whose goal that was, where did that number come from in the first place? So that may be something I have to get more clarity on before I write a final report. Because I think the audience of grant partners, they're not going to, they weren't expecting that. So
Right.
They were not going to be disappointed in that. I do think one limitation that I wish we didn't have is recidivism data is relatively easy for us to get.
Right.
But data on everything else they care about. And again, the partners care about data. They want to know, what about educational outcomes? That's a big one that we right now, I mean, maybe with some legwork we'll find out, but as of now, it's not easy to get. Because there's a lot more that goes into a kid being, a success story besides whether they ever go back, get rearrested.
Well, and it sounds like there's not really a whole, there's so many spinning plates, right? That there's a whole lot going on, that a logic model wasn't really in the offing for the beginning of this business. But maybe now with, you know, with some perspective and even a little bit of data to help inform that, maybe even just a little bit of a logic model to say, here's, you know, the ultimate long-term outcome is we want, you know, recidivism to go down by 50%. What do you have to do in the interim to get to that place, and what do we need to measure in order to know whether we're making progress towards that?
Yeah. There was a logic model in the beginning. I think it was required, but I don't think anyone's looked at it since, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for doing our first presentation in the Learning Community Series. This was really great. And so I will remind folks that they can log back on. This will be posted online once we finish this up. And then folks should be on the lookout. I sent an email earlier today about scheduling the next one in November and then our December meeting as well. And